Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, the chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence. Senator Warner, good to have you with us.
Tom, thanks so much for having me again.
And let's talk about artificial intelligence, especially congressional oversight of it. This could easily devolve into a lot of spinning, like it has with the social media. So on artificial intelligence, where would you like to see oversight actually concentrate so it could do some good?
Well, first of all, Tom, let me acknowledge, and my background, as some of your listeners know, has been in technology. So I think I may be further along than some, but I can't ever think of an issue where there's less relationship between the amount of time I spend trying to learn the subject matter and me actually feeling smarter on the subject matter. I have spent, tens and tens and tens of hours, and just when I think I'm starting to get it, some twist in the industry comes or something else comes forward, and the basic economic premise that who had the most data, who had the most compute, and who could test that the most would win. When we were thinking about large language models, has been a little bit upended by things like when Meta put out its Llama model that was more open sourced, and the idea that you could do individual verticals. So this is a work in progress for me, and I think most members. Secondly, in terms of congressional oversight, I have been fearful because while I'm hanging in on most of these sessions, the number of members who would come to an AI learning session 9 months ago, I could get virtually everybody I invited. By the end, Senator Schumer, the leader Schumer, did a good job of having these sessions. I think there were 3 or 4 of us that would be showing up. So I think members are, I'm not alone in wrestling with it. Third is I think that there is we need to be somewhat humble, and your opening comment, Tom, was a good one, so that it doesn't become this kind of vortex of spinning, which has been around social media, because I'm the first to point out, I put out a white paper on social media concerns in 2017. I thought it was really smart. Not a single idea in my white paper, even though I got a bunch of bipartisan bills, data portability, interoperability, stuff that's kind of low-hanging fruit, has passed. And what now I just said, what could maybe just me as the bad guy advocating, there's not a single, regulatory kind of border on anything on social media. Now, we did see this past week with the Judiciary Committee, where there may be some finally movement on children's online safety. But as we move that to AI, that some of the ideas that people said at first, well, maybe we can have a whole new AI agency, or we can consolidate all this, or some global solution. I think the chances of that are quite small. So let me divide where I think there can be some action taken, where I'm focused, and in 2 areas where I'm focused. Number one, I think there is a real debate going on. The president's executive order was good, broad, but an EO, as your workforce knows, or your listeners know better than most, EOs are great, but they don't go as far as legislation. So should we technically try to fill in the gaps on the EO to make it have a little more juice to it? Jerry Moran, a Republican senator from Kansas, and I have a bill that would kind of get at that by saying when the NIST standards come out, that ought to be the rules that at least all government operations ought to operate against, and large purchasing entities like the DoD. So drive the government as first actor kind of approach as a way to get regulatory, not do the whole society, but start with the government. That's number one. Number two has been, at least where I'm focused, on things like where can AI tools immediately have a screw up tomorrow? And those 2 areas that most come to mind are messing in our elections or potentially manipulating in our public markets. So I've got a bill with Senator Kennedy on public market manipulation that says broadly, let's look at FSOC coming to the table, but also let's make sure that if you have market manipulation, because AI tools can do market manipulation at speed and scale bigger than anything else, there might be higher level of damages because these things would already be illegal, but use of these tools would make more sense, make more challenges. Around elections, there's a series of bills put out by a number of my colleagues, and Brian Schatz in particular has got a good one about mandatory watermarking on some of the AI generated content, because as we pointed out recently in a hearing on Intel side, many of your listeners probably saw there was that fake voice of Joe Biden on a telephone call around the New Hampshire primary. Now, if that had been a fake, assuming Trump and Biden, a fake voice of Trump or Biden 48 hours before the actual election, I mean, that could be chaos. And, having a watermarking or have some indication that this is a non-authentic generated recording would be helpful, although then you have to even get at the next layer down of there will be programs out there that says, okay, you put a safeguard in place, how do you remove that safeguard? So that is a grave concern. And then the final area where I do think there will be I think particularly coming from the Intel side, we can see some action. This is around the national security realm. How do we make sure that some of these tools are not being used to penetrate some of our national secrets? How do we make sure, on something we have obligation on the Intel committee of looking at oversight on safety of our elections, and I'm gravely concerned that we're not as prepared for foreign interference in our elections in 2024 than we were in 2020. So we might, around the national security umbrella, get some things done. So, a little bit of caution that is a big, overwhelming legislation probably won't happen. So filling in, the gaps on the EO, taking areas like elections and or public markets, and then questions around national security are all areas where I think we might see some action. I apologize about the long answer, but it's a great question.
No, quite all right. That sounds like blocking and tackling, depending on what the highest risk might be to national security, to elections. Clearly, those are high on the end, and then you kind of move on from there. And so the legislation you have introduced has to do with markets. What about federal deployment by federal agencies of AI? And, there's a million use cases facing outward toward the public, facing inward toward their own operations. And these are areas you've taken an interest in over the years. NIST is going to develop a framework. The White House, as you mentioned, has the EO out that applies mostly to the federal government. And so what are your thoughts on making sure that the government is a good model for how these things do get deployed?
Well, I think this is where we really do need the input, ideas, and suggestions of our federal workforce. The federal workers should not say, well, we're just going to be worried about how AI tools are going to affect us. We need your ideas. We need your suggestions. So an area that immediately comes to mind is that AI, if not properly trained, if the data isn't correct, can reinforce existing biases. Our federal government has done a pretty good job through the GSEs, through FHFA, through civil rights laws on trying to at least I'd love to say extinguish, but at least curtail blatant discrimination in housing, blatant discrimination in terms of access to capital. But you got these AI tools, and if you haven't trained on the right set of humans, or you're not inputting the right set of data, then all of these inherent biases could be exponentially worse. I've met with a lot of folks in the housing realm in particular, where if you simply do, for example, if you simply do a look back on credit scores, which has historically shown bias towards minority individuals, as opposed to ability to make rent payments, which is more and more becoming a more accurate reflection of somebody's ability to, stay in an apartment, the actual rent payment as opposed to the credit score. And particularly when you're talking about the unbanked, that is your credit scores are really down or non-existent if you're unbanked. So how you train the model will have a dramatic effect on the output. And I hope our federal workers who've had experience, particularly on these frontline issues around bias, keep us as policymakers on our toes to make sure we don't lose sight of that.
Yes, and so I think one of the gambits that is coming to the surface is the idea of what they call synthetic data. That is data that is created for the purpose of training. It may not be real life data, but it's data that has been made so that the outcomes will be supportable in all of those different parameters. Is it biased? Is it accurate? And so forth, or is it accurate and unbiased? And so that could be part of something of a requirement for agencies, is to use good reference data that is synthetically generated.
Yes, but I think, Tom, my understanding though is, if is the synthetic data is still trained on an underlying set of data, and if you've got the biases in that underlying set of data, the synthetic data is going to, garbage in, garbage out. The synthetic data is going to spit that out as well, and synthetic data creation, process, testing is still an area where I'm holding on by my fingernails, trying to fully mentally get it. Particularly if we think we've talked about bias, but what happens if we talk about just the fact that many of these, large language models, ChatGPT 3 or 3.5, and you got a number of answers that come out as hallucinations, where the answers in English, that means just plain wacky wrong. But if that hallucination answer is built, is the basis upon which you do you build your synthetic data on top of that, oh my gosh, that scares the dickens out of me.
Yeah. So then what you said about AI requiring involvement by federal employees kind of takes two ways, two senses. One, you have to have the technologists that understand how the technology works, build the programs and do the testing and so forth. But then you have to have the subject matter experts that can verify, well, everything works properly, but are we, as you say, getting a hallucination, or are we getting something that makes sense in the real world according to the parameters it has to make sense to, which is something the technologist may not know, but the subject matter expert who's not the technologist will, and vice versa.
Absolutely. And again, having our federal workforce, and I believe they will be, honest and candid enough to know that there's so much information. There's so many places where the government is the depository of information. And easy is the wrong word, but a classic area like discriminatory practices, access to capital issues, access to housing. But there are a lot of other areas, from weather data to Bureau of Statistics to a lot of the stuff that comes out of the Commerce and the Labor Department, where it's only going to be the federal workforce in many ways who knows, or who will be aware of where there may be flaws or holes in our existing government data. And that's going to require a level of involvement from the federal workforce where they aren't going to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get penalized because I've been working at the BLS for 20 years, but I inherently know that some of the way the BLS operates is not working. I'm using that as an example. I don't have a specific example of the BLS screwing up, but where workers could come through and say, you know what, before we just take this data set unvarnished and feed it into a model, maybe we ought to think about XYZ.
Recently the public printer, as they used to call it, the director of the government publishing office, testified fairly routinely on the possible uses of AI at GPO. I think it was to the Senate Administration Committee, that oversees the operations here of congressional agencies. And that gave rise to the idea that perhaps every committee will need to be at least familiar with AI use cases, AI general thinking in the domain that committee oversees. You may not know where it works in the GPO if you don't care about the GPO, but if you care about the Defense Department or the intelligence community, then you would need to know that as a legislator.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And I think, it really, in many ways may depend, unfortunately, upon the comfort level of the chair or ranking member on a lot of committees about whether they want to push this. This is an area where I hope, again, most members, myself included, need to be a little bit humble and acknowledge that we don't know everything in this subject matter. And if we move from AI to generative AI and next iterations, it's coming, and having this kind of within each agency or within each department, some recognition of how that department you've got oversight for is using AI is really important. I think about, I've got 18 or 19 Intel agencies. There's obviously the big five, and, way, way long ago in a galaxy far, far away, a year ago in Washington, we sat down with all the Intel community leadership, and I had Sam Altman there, and I had a couple of the other big AI leaders there. And it felt like the Intel community said they were going to build one large language model that would include all our pixels from overhead, that would include most of our, intercepts from NSA, that might include the thumb drives that our spies have obtained, and, a host of other products. And that made some sense to me on how we could query then this aggregated amount of intelligence knowledge. That seems to be being rethought into, well, maybe by, again, agency, you have your own AI model that doesn't touch in any other parts. And if it's, and I've got to drill down better in terms of, well, is that because you got real security concerns, or just the general, protection of your own sphere of influence that you don't want to commingle? And frankly, again, if I'd gone back 15 months ago, I think the notion towards larger aggregation of all data meant you would be more successful. Even that premise, I think, has fundamentally changed in the last, say, 7 or 8 months, where you may not need large, you may still want to attach this to some large language model. And, what's the user interface that could then attach to a NSA vertical and a CIA vertical and an NGA or an NRO vertical? Those are all real-time questions. And again, it gets back to this notion of how are you using AI agency by agency or department by department, which you oversee.
Yeah, you don't want to put every single ingredient in the kitchen into the cake, because you might not like the taste of what comes out. So sometimes you need selectivity even in data. My guest is Virginia Senator Mark Warner. He is chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence. We'll take a short break now and listen to a message from one of our sponsors.